The underground garage of Valenti Global Holdings was quiet in the hour before sunrise, lit by rows of white fluorescent tubes that never dimmed and never truly brightened, the kind of light that made every hour feel like the same hour. Security had flagged the same vehicle 3 mornings running, parked in the same corner near the service elevator, engine cold, windows faintly fogged from the inside. A cold snap that week had pushed overnight temperatures low enough that the pattern finally tripped a review nobody had thought to run before. 6 guards moved toward the faded silver sedan in a loose half-circle, the way people move toward something they don't yet understand. Behind the wheel, Claire Morgan woke to the sound of boots on concrete and the particular silence of men who had been told to be careful. Her fingers closed around her keys out of habit, not intention. She didn't start the engine. She didn't reach for the door lock. She simply sat up, smoothed her hair with one hand, and waited, because there was nowhere in that garage a person could actually run. The guards stepped back before she had to ask them to. Adrian Valenti crossed the garage floor with the unhurried pace of a man who had never needed to walk quickly to be taken seriously. He was the CEO of a company with offices on 4 continents, and in rooms far from this one, he was also something else entirely, a name spoken carefully, a reputation that traveled ahead of him and made space wherever he went. None of that showed in his face now. He looked, mostly, like a man trying to solve a problem that didn't fit any of his usual categories. "Why are you sleeping in my parking garage?" he asked. Not cruel, not performative. A direct question asked the way he asked every question that mattered to him. Claire opened the door. Marco DeSantis, arriving a step behind Adrian, glanced into the back seat with the flat professional efficiency of a man checking for threats rather than secrets, and found none. A folded blanket, a travel pillow gone slightly flat, a battery-powered fan clipped to the headrest, 3 suits zipped into a garment bag hanging from the hook above the rear door, a pair of office heels tucked into a shoe bag on the floor, small plastic containers of food stacked and labeled by day of the week. "No threat," Marco said quietly, and Adrian nodded once, and the other guards drifted back toward the elevator without being told twice. "Give her a minute," Adrian said, and they gave her more than that, moving far enough to be out of earshot while staying close enough to matter, the way trained people do. Claire stepped out of the car, smoothing the front of her blazer, as though the motion could smooth over the last 3 minutes as well. "I'm sorry," she said. "This is an inconvenience I should have found a way to avoid." It took Adrian a moment to understand what she meant by that, and when he did, it surprised him more than the car had. She wasn't apologizing for deceiving him. She was apologizing for the burden of being found. "How long," he asked, "has this been the plan instead of an apartment?" Claire considered the question the way she considered most questions that mattered, weighing the cost of the honest answer against the convenience of a smaller one, and chose honesty because she suspected he already knew enough to catch a lie. "Almost 3 months," she said, most of it in different 24-hour lots around the city, 1 or 2 nights each, so nowhere would notice a pattern. "The cold this week made your garage the only place I could count on staying warm enough to actually sleep. I should have known that would be the week someone finally looked twice." Adrian didn't say anything for a moment. He thought of the last 3 months of 6:40 arrivals, briefing binders finished before he'd asked for them, a woman who never once looked tired in a job that exhausted men half her age. He had admired all of it without asking what it cost. "Why?" he asked, and it wasn't really a question about logistics. It was a question about why she'd let him not know. Claire told him about the rent increase first, because it was the easiest true thing to say. Her lease hadn't renewed on the old terms. The new number wasn't impossible on its own, but it wasn't the only number in her life anymore. Adrian did the arithmetic instantly, the way he did every calculation involving his own payroll. Her salary should have covered a decent 1-bedroom in this city without difficulty. He said as much carefully, without accusation. It would, Claire agreed, if it were only rent. She told him about her mother. Margaret Morgan had been diagnosed with early-onset dementia 4 years earlier, young enough that the word early still felt like a small, cruel joke. She needed 24-hour memory care now, not the cheapest facility Claire could find, and not the most expensive one either, but the one where the staff had learned which songs calmed her, how to walk her back from confusion without frightening her further, how to help her take her medication without an argument that dissolved into panic. After insurance, that care alone took nearly 2/3 of what Claire brought home each month. The new rent on top of it would have taken almost everything left. I looked at the places I could actually afford after her care, and my rent both went up, Claire said. They were not the kind of places I could leave her in and sleep that night. So I decided I would be the one who slept somewhere less than perfect instead of her. She had visited 3 cheaper facilities in 1 week. One had a locked ward that smelled of bleach and something under the bleach. One had a nurse-to-resident ratio that made her stomach turn before she'd finished the tour. One was fine on paper and empty of warmth in person, the kind of place where Margaret would have become one more chart instead of one more person. Most visits weren't dramatic. Most visits, Margaret recalled her by her sister's name, or asked if she was the new nurse, or looked at her with the polite, careful blankness of someone meeting a stranger for the second time in an hour. Claire had learned not to correct her, not to insist on the truth of who she was, because the correction only frightened her mother without ever making the memory come back. Just last month, on an afternoon Claire had almost not visited because she was too tired to make the drive. Her mother had looked at her for a long moment across a game of cards neither of them remembered the rules to, and said, with sudden and total clarity, "You always did take such good care of me." She hadn't used Claire's name. She hadn't needed to. "I can live in a car for a while," Claire said. "I can't live with moving her somewhere that would have made her one more problem on somebody's shift report." Adrian asked quietly why she'd never come to him or to HR or to anyone. Claire's answer came without hesitation. The answer of someone who had turned the question over many times already, alone, in a parking garage, with nothing else to do at 4 in the morning. She had wanted her work judged before her hardship was known. She had seen what happened to people once their struggles became visible. How quickly competence got reclassified as inspiration. How quickly a promotion could be read by an entire office as charity instead of merit. She didn't want a raise because the CEO felt sorry for her. She didn't want an apartment, a private check, a room in anyone's house, a favor with her name quietly attached to it. She wanted the credit for the work she had already done on its own terms, with nothing else mixed into it. "I've stopped 3 cross-division scheduling collisions in the last quarter that would have cost this company real money," Claire said. "I did that before you knew anything about my mother, and I'll keep doing it whether you know or not." I didn't want the 2 things tangled together. Adrian looked at her for a long moment, and something in his usual calculation shifted. He thought about every early morning, every perfectly prepared binder, every crisis diffused before it reached his desk, and understood that none of it had ever been about impressing him. It had been about survival wearing the shape of excellence, and he had mistaken the shape for the whole story. He didn't offer her his home. He didn't offer to write a check. He asked her to come upstairs, into an office that wasn't his, and meet a woman named Denise, an independent employee assistance counselor who specialized in exactly this kind of quiet emergency. Denise arranged an emergency hotel placement for that same night. 7 nights through a corporate housing partner, while the formal hardship application worked its way through review. She was also blunt with Claire in a way Adrian wasn't in a position to be. "You were protecting your reputation," Denise said. "That's a reasonable thing to protect, but you were also sleeping somewhere with no safe ventilation, no working lock but your own car door, and no legal standing if anything had gone wrong. Privacy shouldn't require that kind of risk. We're going to fix the second part, whatever we decide about the first." Claire admitted she hadn't known the caregiver hardship program existed at all until that morning. The benefit was buried 3 menus deep in a portal built for open enrollment, described in language that made it sound like it applied to a narrower set of employees than it actually did, and never mentioned again after her first week of onboarding. She had assumed, reasonably, that a woman with her salary wouldn't qualify, and no one had ever told her otherwise. "These exist," Adrian said. "You should have known they existed months ago. That's not a failure of yours." Claire agreed to the meeting on one condition, stated plainly. Whatever came next had to come through policy that existed for anyone, not through a favor that existed only for her. Adrian said that was the only way he intended to offer it. The next morning, Claire arrived at her usual hour, hair pinned the same way, blazer pressed the same way, coffee in the same reusable steel mug she carried every day. As though the previous morning hadn't happened at all. Adrian noticed the routine differently now. He didn't go looking for what was behind it. He didn't ask which gym she used to shower before work. Didn't have anyone check where she went during her lunch hour. He simply understood, for the first time, that her 6:40 arrival wasn't devotion. It had been necessity dressed as devotion, and the two had looked identical from where he stood. By 7, she had already arranged the 10 o'clock briefing room and confirmed the international call with the Singapore office at a time that didn't require anyone to be awake at 3 a.m. She left a single sticky note on his monitor that read, in her small, precise handwriting, "Lunch. Actual food. Not negotiable." Adrian ignored it, the way he ignored most things that weren't on fire, and worked through the note's designated hour, finishing a due diligence memo. At 1:30, a second note appeared, taped directly over his keyboard so he couldn't type around it. The first note wasn't decorative. It read, "This one isn't either. I had actual work," Adrian said, when she appeared in his doorway a few minutes later with a sandwich she had apparently decided to bring him whether he'd asked or not. "You had a memo that will still exist in 40 minutes, Claire said. "Your blood sugar will not wait for the memo." He ate the sandwich. He didn't tell her, but he noticed that it was better than most of what the executive floor's expensive catering produced, and that she'd remembered, without asking twice, exactly how he liked his coffee. Claire kept a small black notebook in the drawer of her desk, a private accounting of the particular chaos of working for a man who ran two kinds of empires from the same office. It contained no confidential figures, nothing anyone in legal would ever need to review, stick figures with exaggerated eyebrows labeled with executive names, a ranking system for meeting-related disasters, and a sliding index of statements Adrian made that turned out to be catastrophically optimistic. One afternoon, laughing to herself over an entry she'd just finished, she left the notebook open on her desk long enough for Adrian to catch a single line on his way past. "Adrian says this will only take 5 minutes, he read aloud, stopping. "May I see the rest of that?" "You may see 1 page, Claire said, sliding the notebook a few inches toward him and no farther. "The rest requires a subpoena." He read the 5 minutes entry and laughed in a way she had genuinely never heard from him before, not the practiced, measured laugh he used in meetings, but something unguarded. "What's my current rating?" "On the emergency scale, 1 to 10? "An 8, Claire said. "Consistently, you've never once meant 5 minutes. I've stopped believing you the way I've stopped believing weather forecasts." A few weeks later, a new position appeared on the internal job board, Director of Executive Operations, a role that formalized responsibilities Claire had effectively been carrying for months without the title or the compensation to match. She read the posting twice at her desk, feeling something colder than pride settle into her stomach, and went to find Adrian before her better judgment could argue her out of it. "Did you create this because of the garage?" she asked, no preamble, closing his office door behind her. "The recommendation may be older than that morning. The approval isn't. I need to know the difference." "No," Adrian said, and didn't flinch from the question, which was itself an answer she trusted more than the words. He pulled up a file on his monitor and turned it toward her. The documentation was dated 4 months earlier. A role expansion recommendation drafted by the operations department, supported independently by finance, reviewed by a board compensation committee, sitting in an approval queue that had simply moved slower than the work it was meant to recognize. What had changed since the garage wasn't Claire's file. It was that the garage discovery had pushed Adrian to order a company-wide audit of every stalled role expansion recommendation sitting in that same queue, and Claire's case had come up for approval as part of a batch of 11, not as a single favor pulled forward on its own. 11 cases were released the same week, Adrian said. "Yours is one line in that report. I didn't sign off on any of them individually. The committee did, on a schedule that already existed before I knew your name was on the list." Claire studied every date on every document with the same care she gave contract language, because she needed the paper trail to hold up on its own, without her, without him, without anyone's good intentions attached to it. "I want an independent panel to confirm the process," she said. "Compensation benchmarked against the market, not against what feels generous. Responsibilities written down. A clear reporting line that isn't just you deciding what I do from one day to the next." "Done," Adrian said without negotiating a single point down. The independent review took 2 weeks. It confirmed everything the earlier documents already showed. Claire accepted the promotion only after the paperwork existed entirely outside the two of them, in the hands of people who had never heard about a parking garage at all. In the new role, she moved through the building differently, not louder, not more visible, just more clearly the person other departments called when something needed solving before it became a story anyone had to tell a board about. She rebuilt the executive scheduling system from the ground up, eliminating the kind of double-booked collisions that used to cost hours of unpaid overtime from 3 different departments trying to untangle them. Support team overtime dropped by nearly 1/3 within her first 2 months. Not because anyone worked less, but because fewer people were cleaning up messes that never needed to happen at all. She stayed exactly who she had always been, unimpressed by executive drama, quietly, precisely funny, entirely unmoved by anyone's sense of urgency that didn't come with actual evidence attached. When Adrian handed her a proposed itinerary that involved 4 cities in 36 hours, 3 time zones, and a keynote he intended to deliver personally at each stop, Claire read it once, set it on the desk, and said, "A private jet is fast. It is not a time machine." "I've done tighter schedules. You've survived tighter schedules," Claire said. "There's a difference, and the difference is called a hospital visit." She picked up a red pen and crossed out the 3rd city entirely. "If you attempt all 4, I will schedule your funeral for the following Tuesday. I already have the caterer's number." Adrian began noticing things about her that had nothing to do with supervision and everything to do with attention freely given. A torn folder mended with packing tape instead of requisitioned new, leftover catering relabeled and left out for junior staff before it went to waste. Disagreements between department heads, summarized with scrupulous fairness whichever side had been kinder to her that week. None of it was performed for him. All of it, he began to understand, was simply who she was when no one was grading her for it. The respect came first, the rest came slowly. The way weather changes, not a single moment he could point to, just a gradual difference in the temperature of the room whenever she walked into it. Ethan Brooks, senior counsel in the legal department, had worked easily with Claire since her first month at Valenti Global. He remembered her coffee order without being told twice, and split a pair of deli sandwiches with her most Thursdays while they worked through a contract that needed 2 sets of eyes instead of 1. He was competent, unhurried, and entirely unthreatening in the specific way of a man who had never once thought of Claire as anything other than a colleague he liked working with. Adrian noticed. Within a week, his calendar had filled with meetings involving the legal department that had no obvious business existing. A conversation about formatting standards for board memos that ran 40 minutes longer than the subject required. A separate meeting, entirely its own line item, about office paper stock and printer policy. Claire, reviewing the month's calendar against the one before it, laid both side by side on Adrian's desk. "Are you competing with the legal department?" she asked. "Or is there an actual crisis in printer policy I should know about?" "There is always a crisis somewhere," Adrian said. "That's not an answer." He was quiet for a moment. "You're right. I used the calendar to avoid asking an honest question, and it was a poor use of both our time." Claire canceled the remaining meetings without further comment. Marco, briefing him later that afternoon on an unrelated matter, allowed himself one dry observation. "Jealousy is an unusual management strategy," Marco said. "Keep walking," Adrian told him, and Marco did, smiling the whole way to the elevator. Adrian never once mentioned Ethan's name to anyone in a way that could be mistaken for a threat. He never asked security to look into him, never redirected a case away from him, never let irritation curdle into anything that could touch a man's career for the crime of being easy to work with. Marco, in fact, floated the opposite instinct entirely one afternoon, suggesting through a family advisor that the whole housing situation could be quietly resolved through a holding company that already owned property across the city. No paperwork with Claire's name anywhere near it. "No," Adrian said, before Marco had finished the sentence. "Nothing about her stays off the books because it's convenient for us. If she can't tell HR where she lives, she isn't free, she's managed. I've had enough of managing people to know the difference now." Marco didn't offer the idea again. Victoria Sinclair ran corporate communications with the polish of someone who had never once been caught improvising, and Claire had crossed paths with her months before any of this, back when Victoria had wanted to feature Claire in an internal newsletter as an inspirational story of quiet dedication. Claire had declined firmly, on the grounds that her personal life wasn't raw material for a PR calendar, and Victoria had accepted the answer at the time with a smile that didn't entirely reach her eyes. At the annual leadership summit, Claire had built the schedule down to the minute, coordinated 3 time zones of remote executives joining by video, and quietly solved 2 logistical failures before either had ever reached Adrian's attention. During the closing session, an operations vice president stood to publicly credit her for the summit's unusual smoothness, and for a moment the applause felt like exactly the recognition she'd spent 2 years quietly earning. Then Victoria rose from the second row. "I think it's wonderful," Victoria said to the room rather than to Claire, "how compassionate this company has become. The recommendation for her new title may predate anything personal, but the approval didn't. That happened only after Mr. Valenti found her. Let's be delicate about the details. In circumstances that would move anyone, doesn't that raise a fair governance question? Are we rewarding merit or proximity to the CEO's sympathy?" She let the next phrase land deliberately. The assistant Adrian rescued. The room went very quiet. Claire stood before Adrian could. "You're half right," she said, and her voice carried without needing to rise. "The recommendation is 4 months old. The approval came later, as one of 11 stalled cases released the same week. After an audit that had nothing to do with me specifically, I completed every responsibility on every review I've ever received here. I passed every evaluation on its own terms." She turned toward Adrian. "Did you disclose anything about my personal circumstances to this room, to the board, or to anyone outside HR and legal?" "No," Adrian said immediately, "not one detail." Claire sat back down, having turned the entire conversation away from her private life and squarely onto the question of evidence and privacy, exactly where she wanted it. Only then did Adrian rise. He asked the HR director, seated near the front, to bring up the file prepared for exactly this kind of question. The screen showed the original recommendation, dated months before any conversation about a parking garage. It showed the audit trigger, company-wide, 11 cases, none hand-picked. It showed the recusal log confirming Adrian had not personally voted on Claire's file in the Compensation Committee's review. Ms. Morgan's hardship changed the way this company examined its own failures, Adrian said. It did not change the work she had already done. What she carries outside this building is not this room's business, and I won't be discussing it further, tonight or otherwise. The applause that followed came in patches, uneven, honest, a board chair nodding slowly at the dates on the screen, 2 division heads exchanging a glance that suggested they were reconsidering something they'd assumed without checking. Victoria sat very still, watching a narrative come apart in real time. A formal review afterward traced how Victoria had learned any private details at all and found the source, an internal garage incident memo meant only for security and HR that had been improperly forwarded through a shared drive Victoria's team had access to for unrelated reasons. The review closed that access, tightened the memo's distribution list, and opened a separate ethics inquiry into whether Victoria had used the information deliberately to undermine a colleague in public. She was removed from any matter involving Claire, required to issue a formal correction to the leadership team, and placed under review with the possibility of termination if the inquiry confirmed the breach had been intentional. Adrian didn't make her disappear through the other reputation that traveled ahead of him. He let the ordinary, unglamorous process the company actually had decide what her mistake was worth. With her compensation now properly benchmarked, Claire used the temporary housing bridge alongside her own savings and the caregiver support program to find a smaller, equally attentive memory care facility 20 minutes closer to whatever apartment she eventually chose. After a short waitlist a care navigator helped her manage. She found a modest 1-bedroom above a hardware store, signed the lease herself, furnished it slowly with second-hand pieces, and gave HR the address for her employment file and no one else. Adrian noticed the empty parking space before anyone told him anything. He didn't ask for her new address. "You look rested," he said the next time he saw her. "I slept," Claire said. "I'm glad," he said, and meant it in a way that had nothing to do with productivity metrics. The company expanded its caregiver support program company-wide after the same audit that had released Claire's case revealed the same benefits gap had quietly cost other employees far more than a parking garage. The new program was board-approved, administered by an independent third party, and open to anyone who qualified under criteria that had nothing to do with who they reported to. Adrian never reviewed a single application that came through it, including Claire's own renewal the following spring. "You changed the whole system," Claire told him once, "instead of just changing my file." "The system was failing more people than you," Adrian said. "You were just the one I happened to find at 4 in the morning." Once Claire had a bed to sleep in and a door she could lock behind her, she started leaving the office at a reasonable hour, and Adrian began noticing, most evenings around 6, that her office light had already gone dark. He missed it more than he expected to. Claire noticed the distance too, and understood exactly what it meant. Whatever had been growing quietly between them for months had reached the place where it could no longer pretend to be only professional respect, and that recognition came with a genuine problem attached. She still reported, in the end, to the man whose calendar she controlled and who controlled the trajectory of her career in turn. She applied for a director-level position at a subsidiary within the Valenti corporate group, one with its own board, its own president, and a governance and charter that gave Adrian no vote in hiring, evaluation, or compensation for that subsidiary's staff. When the request reached him, his first instinct was the oldest one he had: find a reason to keep her exactly where she was. He recognized the instinct and recused himself from the process entirely, routing it through the subsidiary's own board the way he'd insisted every decision about her be routed since the morning he'd found her car. He met her after work, in a quiet corner of a nearly empty coffee shop 2 blocks from the office. "We've become something to each other," Claire said without preamble, "and people will always question my career if you're the one who controls my salary, my promotions, my schedule, and my title all at once. I won't spend the next 10 years having every good thing that happens to me quietly recategorized as something you gave me instead of something I earned." "I don't particularly care what people think," Adrian said. "I know you don't," Claire said, "but I have to keep working here." He was quiet for a moment. "Most people who get close to me want something I control. You're the first person who's asked me to give it up before you'd let me any closer. And I'm trying not to be offended by how much sense that makes." He supported the transfer. 2 weeks later, Claire took the new position, with a separate reporting line and a written conflict of interest agreement that barred Adrian from any decision touching her role, her evaluation, or her compensation, filed with the ethics office before either of them said another word about dinner. "As my CEO?" Claire asked, when he finally asked her properly. "No," Adrian said, "as the man who noticed his building felt different once your office light stopped being on every evening. No work discussion tonight. No expectation attached to your answer. Nothing changes at either job if you say no." Claire said yes. There was no immediate kiss, no declaration delivered like a merger announcement. There was dinner, and more dinners after it, weekend walks neither of them rushed through, arguments about books that ran later than either intended, a standing habit of watching detective movies so poorly written that Claire kept a running list of their worst lines in the same black notebook that had once ranked his personal disasters. Adrian turned out to be absurdly competitive over board games, a fact Claire filed away for future use with visible satisfaction. When the two of them formally disclosed the relationship through the company's ethics office, exactly as policy required, no new title or raise followed the disclosure, because none was needed and none was offered. Nearly a year after the morning 6 guards had surrounded a faded sedan before sunrise, Claire had a senior operations role she'd built out of documented merit, a modest apartment with second-hand furniture, and a reliable used crossover she'd bought outright with her own savings. Margaret remained in her care facility, safe and known by name to the staff around her. Some days she recognized Claire the moment she walked through the door. Other days she only reached for her hand, uncertain who it belonged to, and held it anyway. One evening, Adrian met Claire in the underground garage on his way out and slowed, without quite meaning to, near the corner where her sedan had once sat. "Old habit?" Claire asked. "Apparently," Adrian admitted. "I sleep in a bed now," Claire said. "I know," he said. "You didn't rescue me," Claire said. "You helped without making the help belong to you." "I had to learn the difference," Adrian said. He offered his hand, there under the same white fluorescent light that had once found her asleep behind a steering wheel. Claire took it. Her competence had never depended on her hardship to be real. Her hardship had only shown how much an entire company had failed to notice while she carried it alone. Adrian hadn't proven anything by buying her an apartment or handing her a promotion she hadn't already earned. He'd proven it by protecting her privacy when it would have been easier to explain her away, by trusting documentation over his own good intentions, and by giving up the power to control her career before he ever asked to stand closer to her heart. Freedom, in the end, had to come before love. Everything that mattered between them had waited for that, and neither of them regretted the wait. "So tell me," Did Adrian really prove himself the moment he gave up the authority to control Claire's career? Or should a CEO never date someone who once reported to him at all?